Okay, welcome everyone to Embrace webinar number 18. We are so glad to have you here with us today. My name is Tim Ciccone, and I'm the Director of Youth Ministry for the Evangelical Covenant Church. And let me just say how incredibly excited I am for today's webinar, as well as this resource being launched. We have been meaning to release this for quite some months. There's been massive delays. We'll call it the curse of 2020. But this is a brand new resource that we are so excited, called the Embrace for Youth Case Studies. And we appreciate everybody being a part of the webinar today. This resource has been a long time coming, and we're excited to give this out, launch it to our covenant churches, our pastors, our youth pastors, all across the denomination. And we are prayerful that this will be a useful tool for you in your communities as we strive to care for teenagers so much better in the future. Just a quick word about Embrace, and for some of you, this will be a reminder. For others, this will be new, but the Embrace resource, the Embrace for Youth resource itself is actually part of this larger ministry initiative launched from the Make and Deepen Disciples team that we call Embrace. Embrace is a suite of human sexuality discipleship resources and learning experiences which are in harmony with the adopted position of the Evangelical Covenant Church, the center of which is faithfulness in heterosexual marriage, celibacy in singleness. These constitute the Christian standard. For more information, you can check out our Embrace website at www.covchurch.org/embrace. We have many more resources there that we hope will be useful for you in your ministry context. In today's webinar, we will take maybe the next 45 minutes or so to dig into this resource, this Embrace for Youth case studies, as well as hear from a panel of incredible youth workers who I have asked to encourage and coach us in our care for teenagers, as well as comment on different aspects of leading a case study experience. But before I say more about the resource, the actual resource itself, and give you a preview of that, I want to introduce our panelists to you. And I'll just ask our panelists to go and unmute their mics, and let me just name them one by one. First of all, let me introduce you to Ginny Olson. Ginny is the Director of Youth Ministry for the Northwest Conference of the Covenant Church. Before that, she was the Director of North Park University's Center for Youth Ministry Studies. She is an author of many helpful and useful books and resources, and she's a great friend of mine. Ginny, welcome. It is great to have you here.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Next is Sara Fisher. Sara is the pastor of student ministries at the University Covenant Church in Davis, California. Sara is a graduate of North Park Seminary. She's ordained to Word and Sacrament in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Sara has also served on the Covenant Youth Ministry speaker team, which she's been a blessing to numerous teenagers on covenant retreats across North America. Sara, welcome. I'm so glad to have you on the webinar.
Thanks, Tim.
And last but not least is Danny Bowers. Danny is the family ministry pastor at Peninsula Covenant Church in Redwood City, California. For over 20 years, Danny has served in vocational church ministry. And I believe not only is Danny Bay Area cool, but Danny, aren't you also a football coach?
I am. Yep, I coach at the local high school right down the street.
Very cool, Danny. It is great to have you with us today. Thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here.
So just a few production notes before we get started. After we're going to talk to the resource, we're going to hear from our panelists a little bit. And then at the end of the webinar today, we will actually have an opportunity for you, our live audience, to ask questions, to kind of engage our panel on different questions that come up during the conversation today. So what I want you to do is when those questions come up that you'd like us to address, please put those in the chat, and we will try our best to get to those questions and highlight and talk about some of the things that you're wondering about. So again, you can put those in the Zoom chat, and we will get to those as best as we can. And at the end of this webinar, I'll be providing the link to the resource as well, along with a few announcements of upcoming opportunities. So with that, let's get started. I want to start by highlighting the resource today, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. and pull up what we are calling the Embrace for Youth case studies. And hopefully you're able to see this good enough. I just want to talk about a few things with the case study itself. So first of all, the goal of this resource is it can maybe be best summed up as an opportunity for healthy discussion around this specific topic. And it's used as an opportunity for growth and learning. What this resource is a series of realistic case studies. In fact, these are taken from real live covenant churches and camps that have lovingly tried to care for different situations across the covenant. And we are trying to put these in a discussion format focused on healthy dialogue so that you and your communities can engage these for continued growth. The goal then of any case study is to give our churches an opportunity to explore how to better care for youth who may or may not be connected to our churches. I'll just scroll down here so you can get a little bit of a glimpse of this and maybe zoom out a little bit. But basically, the resource includes 5 different case studies, complete with discussion questions. And as you can see here, again, you can download this later and look over the different case studies that we have. But we've called one of these When Leadership Disagrees. Another one is how to respond when a student comes out and identifies as LGBTQ+. Still a third is how do we foster a safe and healthy youth ministry for LGBTQ+ youth? And how do we handle and lovingly care for teenagers when they transition? And then finally, we look at a Bible camp accommodation situation and questions around that. So these are some of the case studies that are included. We also include in this resource tips on leading a case study along with a simple glossary of terms. And then finally, just to scroll to our next page, and then we'll kind of move forward. There's 2 points of emphasis that I wanted to name here today when it comes to leading not only a case study in general, but specifically case studies around caring for the LGBTQ community. There's 2 things that I want to say that all of our audience and anyone who watches this video in the future, when you use this resource, the first thing I'll say is this: I want to emphasize how important it is to work with our leadership. So you may be a senior pastor on this webinar today. You may be a youth pastor. You may be a volunteer. Who knows what your role is? We're just so glad that you're here. But anytime we lean into a complicated conversation, a complicated topic. Now, caring for teenagers is not complicated, but certainly there is a lot of other parts to this conversation that can be difficult. We need to make sure that our leadership is on board with where we're going. So if you're a youth pastor, for example, I want to encourage you that a major emphasis needs to be sitting down with your senior pastor and making sure that you two are on the same page, coming up with goals and plans for your community. It's very important that your leadership understands the goal of this case study and your goal in training your leaders around these case study situations. Our goal is to give you an opportunity to have dialogue and to grow from that dialogue. But in order for that to happen well, your leadership, whether it's the board chairman, leadership team member, the senior pastor, they need to know what's going on. So we encourage you to do that. The second point of emphasis is that these case studies intentionally do not provide answers to the questions raised. Case studies in general are not designed to provide answers to questions raised. Typically, case studies are designed to help explore and gain clarity on how to approach ministry in each specific ministry context. So we have not asked the question and then given you our answers. We're asking you as a community to come up with solutions to care better for teenagers in your community. So those are a couple of points of emphasis. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. And again, I want to thank you for checking out this resource. And now that we have this framework for the resource itself, I want to move to our panelists, our 3 panelists now who are going to engage. And I've asked them to actually encourage us and coach us, not only on how to lead case studies well, but how do we care better for the teenagers in our communities. And so we've got a number of questions that I'm going to ask them, but I want to remind you, our audience, if you do have questions that you'd like us to address, please put those in the chat. The first question, I'm going to ask all 3 of you to respond. And Sara, we'll start with you. And Ginny, you can go second. But I would like you just to tell us a little bit about your context. Have you worked with LGBT students in the past? And Sarah, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Great. Well, hi, I'm Sarah. Nice to see you guys. I've been youth pastoring in Northern California for about 6 years. I live in a college town, so our youth group is kind of made up of just a huge mix of kids. We've got kids from our church, we have kids from other churches, we have kids who aren't churched. It's just like this big hodgepodge, and with that comes a lot of diversity in really everything. So we've had a lot of students in our youth group come out in the midst of being a part of our youth group. We've had students who are part of the LGBTQ community join our youth group after they've already been out. And on top of that, most of our leaders, our volunteers, are young adults and college students. So I've actually also walked through quite a few leaders who have come out in the process of leading or just after they've led. So that's a little bit of my context.
Excellent. Ginny.
Yeah, I would say my education with LGBTQ students started at North Park when I was a professor there. And as more and more students would come out, they'd want to grab coffee and they'd start telling me their story. And that's where I started to say, you know what, my education up to this point has been very limited. And so they were gracious and patient. I was thankful I was in Chicago. There were a lot of great resources there that helped me begin to understand what does it mean to do ministry well with LGBTQ students. So they gracious place to start. Here, I now live in the Minneapolis area. So less work with directly with students. Now my work more is with churches, usually historically conservative churches that now have LGBTQ students in their ministries. And they're like, what do we do? We don't have any tools. We don't know how to do this. So I do a lot of coaching with adult volunteer teams, as well as parents who call and say, my kid is polyamorous. My kid is, transitioning. How do I do this? And so a lot of coaching with, and just listening to parents as they're walking that path.
Great. Thank you, Ginny.
Mm-hmm.
Ginny.
Yeah, as Tim said, I've been doing vocational youth and family ministry for 20 years, and 16 of those years have been in California, 4 were in the Midwest, and really it's felt since day one of ministry, this has been a topic of conversation. And as the publicity of the conversation, the openness of the conversation, both in social context as well as political context, has navigated the freedom of students and families and even peers to share where they're at within the LGBTQ community. Our local context where I'm at right now is I'm just a few hours west of Sara in the Bay Area. It's literally right halfway between San Francisco and San Jose on what we call the peninsula. And where we're at, our dynamic of a church is we have some very social dynamic differences within our context, but we also have a lot of different students who, while they may not be LGBTQ themselves, the Bay Area itself is a very inclusive conversation for the LGBTQ community. And so San Francisco is one of the largest pride parades, and we'll find a lot of our students and families supporting their neighbors, their friends and peers. And so for us, this seems to be a weekly conversation in our middle school as well as our high school community. And we've even begun to see it within our kids ministry. And so our entire family ministry team is consistently going, how do we care well for these families, and how do we consistently do ministry well in the context we're in?
Excellent. Well, I appreciate all three of you being on this webinar today, and you each bring a level of expertise that is really beneficial to all of us. The second question I have, and Sarah, I'll ask you to start, and maybe Ginny, if you want to follow up. From your vantage point, why are human sexuality case studies helpful for youth ministry? Sarah, take that one.
Yeah, I think case studies are really important because they allow us to see people as people instead of just an issue. So when you work through a case study, you're entering into someone's story. You may not know whose story it is, but like Tim said, these are based off real stories. And people are not simple, right? It's complex. It has a lot of different layers to it. And really they allow us to be able to think through, how would you react? How would you encourage? How would you challenge? How would you minister to someone in this story? You can have a policy or procedure about something, but when you have a person, a real person in front of you, it changes it a lot. So I appreciate that case studies really give you a glimpse into a story. And often when I hear them, I think of someone who matches that a little bit. Like I might be reading a case study and I'll say, oh, like, man, that sounds a lot like this parent or this student I've had. And it allows me to lead relationally and with empathy, as opposed to just I'm reading an issue or I'm reading a book. And the other side of it, I think, is it gives you a view into stories maybe you've never been a part of. So you might read some of these case studies. I'm going to read some of these case studies I have that I'm like, wow, I haven't encountered that. And so they also allow us to work through how would we react, past, or care for people in situations we've never encountered. And I think that helps us and our volunteers to think about that ahead of time instead of kind of the shock factor of when you have a real person in front of you, but you've thought through already, how would I pastor someone in this scenario?
Really good. Ginny, anything to add to that?
I just want to reiterate what Sara said. I mean, it's about people, and it brings theory and theology to life. And so often we react to the theology we have been raised with. And maybe if we have not done any reflecting on that, it can be kind of this trigger, non-reflective response. And what I find when it comes to sexuality, anything pertaining to sexuality, it is this, I lead with a trigger response. So I was trained that this should be my response without even thinking about it. And it can cause real harm with students, and it can shut down conversations, especially when it comes to students exploring sexuality. They will lead with a question of, kind of testing the waters. How are you going to respond? And if we react with shock, like Sara said, then a student goes, you are no longer safe. I can't proceed any further. The case study gives us the place to go. Let's work through the shock. Let's work through the stumbling. Let's work through the awkwardness in a safe environment that's guided by you as a youth pastor or by a facilitator. And so you can work through that without a student having to bear the brunt of that. Not that, it doesn't make us perfect, but at least kind of gives us, okay, I've walked through this before. I know some of the words I should use, the language, my body posture, and hopefully that becomes muscle memory as we work with students.
It's really helpful. Thank you so much. And I'll move on to the third question. And Danny, maybe you can start us off on this. From your perspective, and obviously the conversation is important, but from your perspective, Danny, how important is this conversation specifically around training up our leaders to care well for teenagers that may identify as LGBTQ? And what are you seeing in your context and your ministry experience as some critical points of focus?
Yeah, I would say over my 20 years, from my perspective, this is a top 3 to 4 training piece for your volunteer leadership. It really has to be. And the reason it's so crucial from my perspective is you're clarifying what is essential for healthy ministry, as well as you're clarifying for leaders how to walk with them in their story, as Sara said earlier. And the ability for our leaders to see the kids and the teens and the parents that they're connected to and realize that like this is a journey for them, and they may come with excitement, they may come with insecurity, they may come with a lot of different emotions, and for your leaders to meet them where they're at and to realize that a huge part of youth ministry and children's ministry is we go to kids and teens. We don't expect them to come to the adult table, and being able to say, we want to meet you where you're at. And I think when our context, it really gives our leaders clarity. Our church is super unique, and we almost have a 70-year history. And so some of our leaders come from as Ginny said, a very clear theological background that they come from, and they bring that to the conversation. And for some of those leaders, we have to remind them that the students and the kids and the families may not be thinking along that theological line. We also have some of our younger leaders that actually may be more inclusive in their own orthopraxy of how they'd like to see the church handle it. And so what we have to do is we have to say, as a ministry, here's where we're at. And then here's where we're at. Here's where we're asking you to care. Because all your leaders are doing, or they're an extension of your pastoral leadership. Paul calls us to equip the saints for the work of the gospel ministry. And that's what we're doing. We're equipping them with what they need. And we're not leaving them high and dry. We're with them, but they're off in the front lines. And so for me specifically, I think one of the most crucial leadership training context pieces has been empowering our leaders to know how to handle this from a caring perspective first and foremost. I think one of the tensions that the leader side gets into as you develop your leaders is this. Leaders have I want to handle the situation this way, we'll fill into this. And as a pastor and as a church leader, as a ministry director, the role really doesn't matter. You're reminding them, hey, this is how we as a local body want to handle this. It's not easy, but I mean, the original question Timmy asked was how crucial is it? And seriously, this is one of the most crucial areas for me specifically.
That's a great word, Danny. I love, and I think I actually put this in the resource, but one of the sayings that I love to share with people is every teenager on this entire planet matters to God. So if every teenager matters to God, they have to matter to us. They must matter to us. And I think you've shown that very well. And hopefully most of our churches are thinking that way, that we don't let the tension around the conversation stop us from caring well for the teenagers in our community, that we're helping them find and follow Jesus. It's a great word, Danny. Thank you. I'll go on to the next question. And Ginny, maybe you can start us off on this, but I'd like to hear from all three of our panelists on this one. And, you know, you all have been doing ministry for a long time, and you've been in the trenches. You've worked with a lot of youth workers as well. And your stories probably are similar to some of ours, but what sort of challenges have you experienced in training leaders in LGBT ministry, and what would you recommend? How can we address those challenges? And Ginny, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, oftentimes when a church brings me in, it's because the youth pastor's like, I don't know how to handle this. and so I come in and I remember one very clear setting where there's a group of men, all about 40s and 50s, and they were sitting in the back like this, you know, just like, I dare you to teach me on this. And I had that, not just pick on men. I've had it with women as well, where they come in with a very clear thing. And it's like, I don't want to learn about this. I have my mind made up. And you just have to be ready that you've got some folks that they think that they've thought this through. And like Danny said, they come in saying, I want to handle it this way. And it can be anywhere on the spectrum theologically that they want to come in. And so you need to be able to say, you know, do some groundwork saying, okay, where is my team at right now? What has their theological training been up until now? How do we handle hard questions in our church? You know, not just sexuality, but other hot potatoes. How do we handle that? And you may need to even begin by teaching some crucial conversations. How do we deal with tough issues? How do we counsel adolescents? And so you lay that groundwork. And to know that sexuality is an awkward topic for a lot of people. And so how do we talk about sex, sexuality, sexual identity with our leaders? To know that, so their historic theology comes out, how they were raised, culture comes out as well. You know, how is sexuality treated in your culture? What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? Have you talked about that? How do you teach students? What is that implicit theology that's throughout your curriculum in other areas? And so you got to do a lot of plowing the ground before you even begin to talk about that. And so that people hopefully come with the attitude of, I'm ready to learn. And what does it mean to be a minister to adolescents? I mean, Danny just nailed it in his, this is how we set up our leaders to really minister to adolescents.
It's really good. Danny or Sarah, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Ginny's right on. I serve in a context where we have people who are coming from a bunch of different theological spectrums on any side. Our leaders are. So it's challenging to lead with people who believe differently on things. And I think one of the biggest challenges is it actually just takes a lot of time. That if you are going to walk with a leader through leading well, it takes a lot of conversation. It's discipleship you're actually doing with that leader when you're training them. So I've had a lot of times where I've just had to sit down and have conversations with leaders where I've played out, what would it look like? You know, the hard things of like, what can you say and what can you not say if you disagree on one way or another? And building trust with that leader, that you guys are on a team together, even though you may not, fully agree, but you're going to support, you're going to teach, and how are you going to do that? What does that look like for you? So giving space for leaders to work it out, and just spending the time with them, the phone calls, the texts. Hey, I'm in this situation. What does this look like right now? But also what a joy that we have leaders, I think, when they do that well, who can come alongside and say, I want to figure this out, and you get to walk with them through that.
That's great.
Sarah, you took one of the values, like time. Well, we call it time and touch points. Like some of our leaders need a lot of time. If this is honestly a new conversation for them, we have circumstances where a couple of our leaders have said, hey, I've actually never talked with someone in the LGBTQ community before. And so this student sharing with me, or this parent sharing with me where their family's at, is the first time ever. And honestly, those leaders need more time and more touch points from myself or other staff. And then we have some other leaders that they need less time talking about how we want to handle it, and they need more time, to what Sarah said. Like, they need their own story unpacked. They need us to give them space to maybe even push back or think through conversation pieces. And so time and touch point is a way that we surmise it. One of the other challenges that we have often found is the ethnic and cultural background plays into this big time for a lot of different settings. And we've noticed that within our setting, Bay Area is it's a melting pot that's very multicultural, very multi-ethnic. And some of those ethnical cultural pieces, they play into the conversation that leaders have from their own background. And that's something for me as a cisgender white male, I have to be very mindful of how can I meet them where they're at. And I may not be the best person, but I can partner with someone else and we together can go together. And that's where some of our leaders, when we find they're healthy in this conversation, both from their own learning, both from their experience, both from their language, both from their care, we open this dialogue. So we try to reduce the one-on-one conversation, and we try to create spaces for time and touch points for several leaders at the same time. And for us, like, the coffee conversations are huge. Like, how do we just create space and time? The challenge in that is we don't always have the time with our leaders we want. And so this kind of feels like a spinning plate at times. Like, how do we keep health in every area of ministry?
Yeah, that's so good. Everything the three of you just shared, I think also just highlights the point we made at the beginning of the webinar. It is so critical that because of the complexity of this conversation and because of the significant role of discipleship in our leaders, in our youth, we have to be on the same page with our leaders. We have to be on the same page with our senior pastors, our leadership teams. I just want to restate that because this is such an important conversation, and everything that we just shared, we've got to get it right. And in order to get it right, we need to make sure that we're leading up well. We got one more question for our panelists before we jump into the Q&A from our audience. And we've got a few questions ready to go from our audience. And I'd like to just encourage our live audience, if you have more questions, please go ahead and post those now, and we'll get to those as best we can. The last question I have, and Sarah, you can start with this, and then Ginny and Danny, you can follow up as ideas come up. But, you know, we just talked about training people, but I want to talk about a little bit more specific about looking at case studies in general. What are some of the best practices for training leaders through case studies? And I mean, kind of big picture things. Sarah, could you give us some coaching tips or ideas, things that have worked for you in the past around training leaders?
Yeah, so this is true of training leaders, but I think especially with case studies because they're stories. So I like to start with like creating a fun environment. Like, you need to have an environment where people feel like there's trust and they can talk to each other. Yeah. So we always start with food. Food is the great bringer together of people. So when we train leaders, we eat together and we share, like, what's a funny story of something ridiculous one of our youth did last week? Like, let's laugh about it, let's share what's going on in our lives. And then usually I will just introduce what we're talking about. And if we're doing a case study, we split up into small groups. I know that that's in the resource, like, the smaller groups, I think the better. And we give them, hey, read through this, talk through, what would you do? What would this look like? Have you experienced this? And then we get back together and I have leaders share. What was your case study? What did you guys talk about? And I think the secret sauce to this is I just let leaders talk it out. And they might say things that you completely disagree with. And I just let them talk. And then you can redirect it. I say things like, oh, that's interesting. Like, tell me more about why you said that, or where did that come from? Or yeah, like, have you experienced that before? I don't shut it down. And I think that's key, that when you're reading a case study, you're entering into a story and you want your leaders to be able to like look at it from different angles and to share honestly, this is how I would react or how I have reacted in that situation. Um, and so I just ask like, oh, that's interesting. Does anyone have a different perspective? But I think what Tim said about being clear is important. So at the end, I just always come back and say, we've talked about a lot of things, but here's where we're going to land on this. Here's where we're coming from, or this is our best practice for how we engage in this situation. So creating an open dialogue and then being able to kind of clarify at the end has been really helpful for us.
Good. Danny or Ginny, what would you add to that question?
Yeah, I love the food piece. Meals and training leaders honestly helps any sort of environment. We always declare the type of meeting we're having. So we say, hey, this is a discussion meeting, not a decision meeting. And so we want value discussion.
That's great.
And in doing that, we declare our values as a ministry, remind them that we're about the gospel, we're about community, we're about connecting leaders with or students with caring leaders. So we remind them what our overarching values are. And then some of the same things Sara mentioned is like we read the case study, we would dialogue around it, we'd give them individual opportunities to discuss it amongst themselves. And again, we always let conversation, regardless of where they're at, orthopraxy or orthodoxy, run with it, unless it steps outside of our ministry values. And then we remind them, hey, wait a minute, that's not a value of ours. So let's come back to our values. That's honestly the only time our staff usually interjects, is when it feels like it's getting outside of those boundaries we've created. But the other thing we do is we never leave a conversation about using a case study unless we connect it to someone we personally know. I really believe that when you're training your leaders, and I love what Ginny said earlier, that we remove our theology and our theory with outside of the case study to the personal. And there's times where we'll often ask our leaders, hey, who does this connect to you with? Like this, like give us a name, give us a situation, give us a family that you can relate to on this. And I believe that when we get really personal with people, it matters more. I think it also allows us to know when we're personally praying for people, it's hard to approach them with an agenda, because it's not our agenda. We're caring for them the way Jesus would. And so those are a couple things that we try to keep in mind when we're training leaders.
That's great. Ginny, anything else to add?
This was good. I'm curious, can I ask a question?
Please, yeah.
Okay, Sara and Danny, what do you do when conflict starts arising from the case study discussions? Like you got two volunteers, do not see eye to eye on how to handle the case study. How do you guys navigate that?
Sara, you want to go first? You want me to?
Danny unmuted quick, so I thought he had a.
Oh, I just heard my name, so I'm muted. I'll go first. Ginny, if it's theologically driven, it's a little harder. It truly is, because you are not going to change someone's theology in a 5-minute rebuttal response. You're just not. So if it's relational driven, that's where we go back to our values. What is it? What is our missional statement about student ministry or kids ministry about? And we reinforce the values. And that's honestly where I feel the pastoral voice, the leader voice, needs to step in and go, wait a minute, I understand you may personally feel that way, and we want to honor you in that personal feeling, but collectively we have already stacked hands on the ministry values, which you have decided to. You've actually signed a contract. We have our leaders sign a contract. So we already have that in play. And when we've had to go to that accountability step and say, you've already agreed to this, you're already supporting of it, we're happy to dialogue around it. But if we get disunified here, what's it going to do for our care for teens? And trying to remind the bigger picture. But then I have to follow up, or a staff has to follow up. We need to call that leader and go, hey, we really want to honor you. So can we give you some more space to talk this out? I've even seen our leaders say, hey, let's take this offline and let's meet up together to talk about this. And I've been invited into those. And sometimes we have to go, look, unity is not uniformity. That's a big value that we dig at. So, but how can we still be unified in our approach to ministry? When it's theological, I go back to my time and touch points. Like I need to give time for us to talk through the theology, but I need my leaders to be learners. And I have found sometimes if leaders are in disagreement, how much of a learner are they willing to be? That tells me a lot about their own maturity. And that's a whole different conversation. But those are a couple of things I try to be mindful quickly, Ginny, for your question.
Great. Thank you. Sara, anything to You want to frost the cake?
No, the follow-up piece was what I was going to comment on too, like making sure that you give that leader some time, like one-on-one, two-on-one, whatever it is, to say like, I heard you, right? Like I heard that something was hard here, and let's talk about it. It's good.
Yeah, that's really good.
Thanks, you guys.
Yeah. One of the questions that's come in, I think will be helpful, and it's right in line with where we're talking. Somebody said, I feel like it might be difficult to just jump right into these case studies with my leaders. So panelists, they're asking you, what kind of pre-work would you recommend to get people ready for the case study conversations? Oh, that's so good. Who wants to tackle this one first?
I don't have a big thing, but I think telling your leaders ahead of time is huge, right? So they should not show up to a meeting talking about human sexuality and have no idea that's what you're going to talk about, because like it is such a personal thing.
Yeah.
You're just not setting your leaders up to have a good conversation. So I think even just, hey, this is what we're talking about. I want you to pray about it, or maybe I want you to read the case study ahead of time and just think about it. I think you have to know your leaders if that's going to make them more heated to read ahead of time or not, but to definitely give them a heads up of what conversation they're walking into is important.
That's good.
I would add to that, have them do some thinking about their own sexual story. So it's like, what were your aha moments when you're not looking for the dirt of their past. It's like, when did you realize your gender? When did you realize, all these different things? And so that helps them just reflect and go, okay, what did I think about sexuality and gender when I was a 7th grader, when I was a 10th grader? What was I being taught by my parents, by my community? And so they come in primed to start, okay, I can see this not just from a different perspective, but even a different perspective within myself. So it's one suggestion.
Really good. Danny, someone's asked, I think, a question specifically for you and something you commented on. They asked, how do you explain the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy on the issue? Could you just comment on that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic of orthodox is obviously within your theology and that theological spectrum that's going to shape we would say almost eternal value of this. And so within the orthodox, within the theology, we have a statement of faith as a church that we have made around human sexuality. We have created resources of that, and we also mirror what the ECC stance is. And so that's kind of our line. That's our boundary line that we would say. But within that, the nuance of the relational side of it is incredibly important. And so this is the beauty of the body of Christ, where an individual may have a different theological line, but yet they can still serve or be a part of a church in this setting. And the orthopraxis, how does the relational side play out? We really believe that if you're relational with people, that if they have a heartbeat in their chest and breath in their lungs, they are made in the image of God. And so being made in the image of God, that if that is your theology, that every person bears the image of the Creator and the divine, and Jesus died and resurrected for them, then what does it look like to care for them where they are at? And in where they are at may be really messy to you. Have you ever thought about what it's like for them? And I think that's where so often we find ourselves saying, hey, I'm going to lay down some theological convictions, not reduce them, but I'm not going to make it the most important piece of this conversation. And I would say for some of our older leaders, watching them walk through that process with teens is really empowering to some of our younger leaders. And for us to go, look, at the end of the day, are we responsible for formulating the theological convictions of every kid and teen for the rest of their journey? Or are we a part of their story? And in being part of their story, what are they going to look back on in the season of life? Are they going to look back on someone who walked with them through both the care and their faith questions, or someone who just kind of met them at the door and go, well, if you don't believe this, then you're out? And I'm having you in that more, but that's kind of how I'd start with that conversation.
Yeah, so good. Thank you, Danny. I think generally speaking, I think this pre-work conversation and understanding even these dynamics that you're explaining just now, Danny, I mean, this is the critical part of the conversation, that we need to do everything we can to set this conversation up to be fertile soil, no matter where somebody's coming in. And we live, as we all know, in a day and age where everything is polarized. You can't talk about politics or race or religion without there being two sides of the issue. But what we're trying to focus on here, as Danny just talked about and our panelists have talked about throughout, is that every teenager matters to God. Every teenager is created in the image of the Lord. They must matter to us. And I feel like we need to know our community. What can we do to create a safe place for a healthy, growing discipleship conversation around caring for teenagers? It's excellent, excellent work. We've got a very interesting question that's come in from one of our audience members that I think I'll respond to briefly at first, and then I'll throw it to the panelists to add to it. But someone said, thanks for the panel. What are some best practices to prevent the possibility of projecting case studies onto other people? For example, there may be similarities within a case study that can connect with someone we may know, but it may be problematic if we are assuming similarities about individuals. And I will say a very general comment, and then any of our panelists, if you'd like to add to that, I'd love to hear what you think. But I will just tell you, on behalf of the Covenant Church, any resource that we produce, we're giving it to you with the understanding and hope that you are going to make it work for you in your community. So if you read through a case study with your senior leader or your leadership team member, and the two of you are like, hey, this is actually very similar to a pastoral care situation that we're engaged in right now, you may choose to change some of the nuances of the case study so that it can't be related to that situation, so that it lands better with people and gives people a better chance to have a dialogue. But you're welcome to adjust this to fit your context as best you can. Sara, Ginny, or Danny, would you add anything to that?
I think reminding your volunteers and your staff that this is not like a playbook or an answer book. This is about figuring out what your posture is, especially relationally. We've agreed where we are theologically. This is about how you relationally minister to students. So I think reminding that, like, this might not apply to, actually it probably is different for every kid that we interact with, but we're looking at where is our posture as these things kind of come up.
It's good.
That's great advice. And I would add to that. I mean, what we're trying to help our leaders do is really listen to the Holy Spirit. In all my years of working with adolescents and young adults, I've never had situations where I've had to listen to the Holy Spirit more than I have when it comes to conversations about sexuality, where I just need to be quiet. It's like, okay, God, what are you trying to do here? Give me wisdom. Let me know when to be silent, when to speak. And that's what we want in our volunteers too. That John 4, Jesus talking with the woman at the well, it's like you sit, you listen, you create an environment where you can focus on them. And so really trying to give them that discipline, no matter what the case study is. It's like, these are the basic practices that you need to embody as a leader.
That's very good. Thank you so much. We've had a number of Danny, did you want to comment on that one? I don't want to.
The only thing I try to remind myself often is this prescriptive or descriptive? And I think that, like, if the case study feels prescriptive, it can kind of maybe lock you in to literally what Ginny just said. Hey, Holy Spirit, what are you doing in this unique setting? Case studies are descriptive of a specific situation. And so let's not assume that the same practice or tactics are going to work across the board. But what is unique about this story and this setting that we can at least have some perspective on? But the Holy Spirit piece is exactly what we try to coach as well.
Yeah, that's great. We've had a lot of questions about resources, and we've had someone ask about pre-reading that people could do, or other resources that would be our go-to. Can you, three of you, just maybe name one or two resources that you would recommend as something our youth workers and our lead pastors and any volunteer that's even on here, the webinar today or watching in the future, that they could check out, participate in?
Yeah, a couple that we go to. Gregory Coles is a friend of mine. He wrote Single Gay Christian. He also has another book come out. He is someone who grew up on actually the mission field and is gay, but he is choosing celibacy in that. It's his own story, and that's been really powerful. Jackie Hill Perry's Gay Girl, Good God, her story of where she's at and now living even in a mixed orientation marriage has been an incredible voice for us. We are big fans of Preston Sprinkle as a ministry, Center for Faith and Sexuality. And so a lot of the resources that are put up there, and they actually have a youth curriculum coming out soon that I've seen some behind the scenes on that is really helpful for especially those volunteer settings that are like, we just need some help on this. So those are three I would definitely start with.
Good. Anybody else?
I think those are great recommendations, Danny. I would add Guiding Families of LGBTQ plus Loved Ones by Bill Henson. Just even the layout of that book is really easy and approachable. So it's been helpful for us and our volunteers to kind of look at how do you approach families, how do you care well for not only students, but the entire family unit.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. And just as a plug, I did interview Bill Henson in one of our Embrace webinars. It was a long time ago. It's probably a year and a half, maybe more ago, but it was when the first edition of Guiding Families came out. And, you know, he has a deep love for teenagers, adolescents, and I would highly recommend that resource as well. We've had a really interesting question come in that I'd like us to try to answer. We're coming to the end of our Q&A time, but this is an important question, and I'd love for any of you to weigh in on it. And it's related to sort of the negative narrative around caring for students who identify as LGBTQ. Someone said, how do you talk to students or leaders who see Embrace or even these case studies as a more assimilate or get out narrative, right? And I think every one of us in our communities are wrestling with that narrative that's there, sort of an us and them mentality. Would any of you like to take a big swing at that one? How do you talk to students and leaders who might see this on the negative side, like either assimilate or get out? I see no microphones unmuting, so that means it's up to me. I'll just say this. I want to acknowledge that this definitely will be the narrative in a lot of our communities. And one of the, I guess, encouragements that I've been making to a lot of our churches across the Covenant Church is that we need a new shared narrative. We need a new story. And I think what you've heard from our panelists a lot today is that we absolutely need to lean into the biblical narrative that also comes through the context of a relationship. And if we begin with that relationship, that every teenager is absolutely a priority to us, that every teenager matters to us, as the discipleship narrative continues on, as the Holy Spirit does the Holy Spirit's work, I think that begins to tear down those walls to some degree. And I'm certainly not trying to sugarcoat it. I understand that it is difficult at times. But I would say that we need to lean into a new narrative, that the future of the church in this conversation needs to be one that doesn't create a boundary between us and them. It may not be everything you wanted to hear, but that is my reaction to your question. And of course, I'd love to, whoever asked that question, love to dig into this with you individually if I can be a help in the future for that. Oh, Ginny unmuted. That means she's also got something to add.
No, I saw Danny unmuted, and so I want to hear how he was going to respond.
Thanks, Ginny. Appreciate that. So that question is actually pretty personal for me because we've had some leaders and I've actually had peers in ministry step away over this conversation. And I think that idea of assimilate or get out that is totally driven in an us versus them dynamic. And I can't remove my empathy, but I also need to hear their story. And often it's personal to them within the LGBTQ community, or that's really personal to them because they are experiencing tension or they have family or real dear friends. And I've found that I'm actually not there, that I shouldn't be the best voice. And so I've worked really hard to stay connected to LGBTQ community friends that are both believers and not, and to create space where if I send someone who's in tension or conflict to them, that my friends in the LGBTQ community know that I've sent someone I trust for the sake of the conversation. And I think the privilege the church has is there's actually a lot of resources and there's a lot of healthy connections out there. I think pastorally, we have to work hard to make some of those connections for people to be heard, but also hear from another perspective. And I think that's one of the great points of something like this, Tim, of a webinar and the connection of Embrace. Of, for some people, this may be the beginning of a journey. It may be halfway through. It may be tension in it, but be okay living in tension and still having conversation. And that's such a root for me, because I see that in the early church. I mean, so much of Paul's letters were like, you're living in tension because there used to be, and now there's this way. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, like you have to just cut ties on relationships. And I think for me, I personally come back to what's the relationship that we're trying to foster in all of this.
Yeah, that's really good. I appreciate that, Danny. And I appreciate the comment. By the way, we did get a chat message just now that commented on somebody putting a surfboard away in the background of your house.
Roland. Yeah. My 17-year-old just got home from surfing this morning. He and some buddies went out. It's Veterans Day. There's no school, even though they're online. So they went out surfing today. And it is a brisk Bay Area, I think 52 degrees today right now.
So good. As we wrap down the webinar today, I do want to just give each of you an opportunity to kind of have the last word before I highlight a few other things. The question, I guess, is regarding the Embrace for Youth studies, regarding caring for teenagers, regarding training your leaders, panelists. Is there anything specifically you just want to name as kind of the final word in this webinar that would be helpful for our youth workers to know before they lead their leaders, or as they're continuing to lead their leaders in this conversation? And Sarah, why don't we start with you? I'm going to go around and all three of you have just kind of the last word.
Awesome. I love, Tim, what you said, like all teenagers matter to Jesus. And I think if you can start there, no matter where you are, and continually remind your leaders of that, like what a beautiful thing, not just for LGBTQ ministry, but for everything we do. So I love that. But also, I just want to say, like, if you as a leader feel like awkward or like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, like, welcome. I think we're dealing with people and it changes constantly. And so I just want to say you're not alone in that. And also, we just are so lucky in the covenant to have a community of people that we can reach out to and just ask questions and figure it out together. So don't hesitate to do that as you're walking along.
Awesome. Ginny.
This is going to continue to be one of the driving questions for this generation and the next generation. So do your work. Figure out how have you been brought up and what have you been taught about your theology and your sexuality. And also to realize maybe the flip side of your personality, how you lead in ministry. So some of us really want to be really gracious and accept everybody. And it's like, okay, what's the downside of that when it comes to sexuality? Or some of us are discipline and this is what the Bible says. Well, what's the downside of that? And so to examine that and go, how is that bringing grace? How is that a gift? But also, how could that also cause some harm or damage if I let that play out? So I'm going to leave it there. That's a little squidgy, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to get at there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Danny, final word.
I think for me, there's such a value in reminding ourselves that the gospel is super transparent in the fact that God came to us in a redemptive way and is calling us to live out the kingdom here on earth. And what Ginny said about your own theology is huge, because navigating personal bias and navigating personal formation and understanding where that comes from and walking with that well allows you to be able to say, okay, what may I be missing? And that's not from authority of scripture. That's not from a sense like we've misread text. It's a sense of like, what does it look like for me to see the other side of this? To do that, I think you have to have EQ. You got to have a lot of emotional quotient in this conversation, which means you got to do some work. And if you don't know where to start, be humble enough to go, I need a place to start, and I need someone to talk this out with. I worked in a ministry setting that this was not a safe conversation for staff, and it was not a safe conversation for our people. And it was one of the harder seasons for me pastorally to be in that setting. And so it's okay to reach out and go, hey, I need help. And that I just need help knowing where to start and where to navigate this. There's too many resources out there to educate yourself and to be learned, for you to then lead others. And I think that's the weight of leadership is like, leaders go first. And so if you want others to be trained, you have to also be able to navigate that well.
That's so great. I appreciate that so much. Thank you to all three of you. You know, my final word on the topic before I just make a couple of announcements is we're called to care for a Generation Z, or even millennials, but particularly Generation Z, who has a completely different perspective on sexuality than most of generations that are older than Generation Z. And for those of us in positions of power and responsibility in leadership, our posture of care, pastoral care, of discipleship, it will matter. And the way that we reach out this generation will be critical. So I recognize there are some serious generational differences that we've named a little bit today and that some of you have even asked questions about. But if we pursue relentlessly this generation, reminding them of the love of Christ and letting the Holy Spirit do the Holy Spirit's work, I know that God will use these efforts, no matter how complex and difficult, how complicated things can be. And may God bless you on that journey. This has been a absolutely fantastic conversation. And I just want to thank our panelists for leaning into a hard conversation today and coaching us, encouraging us. And I pray that you, our viewers, will walk away having some useful encouragement in your hands, that these case studies will be a tool for you to use with your leaders to raise up a group of covenanters who will see the calling to teenagers and the complexity of this generation, and that we will follow Jesus to that generation. And God bless you on that journey. And before we go today, I just want to make just two quick announcements before our hour is up, and really want to invite you to our next two webinars. We've got a couple of great conversations, webinars just like this coming up. The next one actually is in December, and that would be Embrace webinar number 19, the title of which will be The Deeply Formed Life. We'll be talking about race, sexuality, and social justice. Join us for a conversation with Rich Valadas on his new book, The Deeply Formed Life, 5 Transformative Values to Root Us in the Way of Jesus. This will be a webinar with a special focus on racial justice and sexual wholeness. And again, that is on Thursday, December 3rd at noon Central Standard Time, and it will be an hour long. So that will be Embrace Webinar 19, Thursday, December 3rd. And then also in the new year, we'll be highlighting Embrace Webinar number 20. In February, we'll be having a conversation topic with the topic of emerging gender identities, understanding the diverse experiences of today's youth. So this will be a conversation with Dr. Julia Sadusky on her book authored with Dr. Mark Yarhouse. They authored a book called Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experiences of Today's Youth. So their book is going to be exploring Christian responses to diverse gender identities, and we will be talking about that at this webinar. And that will be a webinar focused more on youth and young adults, and we hope you can join us as we interview Dr. Sadusky. That will be phenomenal. That is on Wednesday, February 24th, 2021, from noon to 1 Central Standard Time. You can find all the information on our webinars, and honestly, most of the resources that were named earlier today on our Embrace website. Once again, that website is covchurch.org/embrace. And again, I just want to thank you for being a part of this. It has been an honor to serve you today. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Danny, for your wonderful words of encouragement. What a great encouragement you are to each of us today. So again, to our live audience and those that are watching this in the future, thanks for being a part of this. God bless you all, and God bless you as you pray and care for the emerging generation. Thanks, everyone. Have a great, great day. God bless you.